Ladies and gentlemen, we could have your attention. In a few minutes, we're going to be proceeding with Brian Jenkins and his distinguished panel up here on the dais. I would like to welcome Raik from the village of Beit Jan, who is very active with the Institute for Counter-Terrorism. He's of the Druze community here in Israel. This community is a community which contributes tremendously to the IDF and to everything that Israel stands for. Bekef, Raik. Raik Takum. Okay, let's have a hand for Raik, okay, from Beit Jan, okay? In the Jewish and democratic state of Israel, okay, the Druze play an integral role. And I have to tell you that in our Declaration of Independence, that liberalism and that egalitarianism is part of the Zionist movement and sets us apart from all of the countries around us. We cherish the democratic state of Israel. And now, on a totally different subject, I would like to invite Galit Berdugo to come up here. She's going to be speaking about Dr. Jonathan Fine, who unfortunately passed away. And this next session is named for him. Galit, the floor is yours.
The late Dr. Jonathan Fine was a senior researcher at the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, a faculty member at the Lauder School of Government at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, and a dear colleague and friend who passed away 3 years ago at the young age of 57. Jonathan's sudden death occurred during a speaking tour in the Far East, which began in China and Japan and ended with these tragic circumstances in Australia. Those who knew Jonathan well knew how great a scholar he truly was. As the grandson of one of Israel's greatest poets of all time, Alexander Penn, Jonathan inherited a love for art and literature and wrote literary publications. Mario ran far in 2001. The greatest of them is Love in 2003, and On Three Bridges in 2005. Jonathan was a spiritual person and a man of values, and as such, he was ordained as a conservative rabbi. Jonathan was a leading scholar, specializing in religion, fundamentalism, and political violence, with special emphasis on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He also had a deep interest in Middle Eastern and Israeli studies, with special emphasis on US and EU policies in the region. In this framework, Jonathan published 3 books: The Birth of a State, The Establishment of the Israeli Governmental System in 2009, and Political Violence in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, From Holy War to Modern Terror in 2005. Most recently, in March 2018, in a joint effort by the Lauder School of Government and Jonathan's family, his 3rd book, finished right before he passed, was published, titled A State is Born, The Establishment of the Israeli System of Government. As part of his work as faculty member at the Lauder School of Government, Jonathan served as an academic advisor to students. As such, he was one of the most beloved and popular faculty members among students. Jonathan educated generations of students, counseled them in their academic path, and instilled in them knowledge and love for learning, as well as respect and love of man. We are honored to have Jonathan's family here with us today. Jonathan will always be part of ICT and the Lauder School of Government. May the memory of Dr. Jonathan Fine be blessed.
On a personal note, regarding Jonathan, my office has a window which faces out into the parking lot where Professor Reichman parks. And practically every evening before Jonathan would go home, he'd speak through that little window to me usually speaking about the needs of students. He cared tremendously about the students he was teaching, mainly in the English language. And we really, really miss Jonathan a lot. So it's a real shame he's not with us here today. Now, without any further ado, the class act, the one and only Brian Jenkins. All right, take it away, Brian.
Am I on here? Good. Look, we've got a complicated topic here that could be the subject of an entire conference, and we've got an hour to deal with this. So we're not going to stand up at the podium and try to give lectures, but really try to just move this along very, very quickly. Our topic is the future of jihad, and you know, if we go back to let me be historian for a moment here. In 1897, government troops surrounded a town called Canudos in Brazil's backlands, which was the stronghold of a fanatic Christian preacher and his followers. And this was the culmination of a 2-year campaign. And in the final battle, all of his followers, just about all, about 30,000 people, were killed. A couple of years later, outside of Khartoum, the forces that were loyal to the so-called Mahdi, who had created the Mahdiya, another version of a caliphate, had lined up for the final defense of the Mahdiya, and there was about 50,000 of them, and they charged against the British forces that were there, and the estimates vary, but somewhere between 10 and 20,000 of them were killed, and the others were pursued. Fast forward to Hama, 1982, an Islamist rebellion in Syria, and the government forces under Hafez al-Assad surrounded the town of Hama and opened fire with tanks and artillery, and anywhere between 10 and 40,000 people were killed. I mean, we've seen ever since the Jewish revolt that religious inspired rebellions often end in slaughter, but that the slaughter doesn't necessarily end the religious revolts or the movements. And the reason I call attention to these historical examples is that we look at Syria today, and there is a battle shaping up, what may be the last major battle of the Syrian civil war in Idlib, where the rebels, now completely dominated by the jihadists, are holed up and facing the final assault by the combined Syrian, Iranian-backed, and Russian-supported forces. So what happens next? No one believes that the Battle of Idlib, or that the destruction of the caliphate as a territorial expression, is going to end the jihad. That's not realistic. Assad clearly will have won. He has already won the civil war, although he survives primarily dependent on Iranian-backed militias and Russian air power. But the struggle will go on in some form. Underground in Iraq and Syria in some fashion, and of course ISIS has established footholds, alliances, colonies across Africa, in the Middle East, all the way into Afghanistan. At the same time, Al-Qaeda continues through its affiliates in the Maghreb, in Somalia, and Yemen to wage its campaign. It has perhaps an advantage over ISIS in that it has longer experience with running a distributed underground network as opposed to forces on the field. In looking at these events, a friend of mine, Dr. David Rappaport, some years ago, wrote a long essay about the 4 waves of terrorism historically, and the religious-inspired terrorism that we see today was his 4th wave, and the implication was that this wave, as all the others for it, will decline. And so that leads to the question, are we at least on the downhill side of the jihad? Cautionary note here, Al-Qaeda has proved remarkably resistant, and people have declared that we were near strategic victory a number of times, only to be badly disappointed. Some others have looked at the same set of circumstances and concluded that this latest expression of jihad through ISIS, through Al-Qaeda, is merely the latest iteration of a long religious struggle that goes back centuries, and that this is and ultimately the clash of civilizations that others have written about. And if that's the case, then this thing continues to Judgment Day. So somewhere between a struggle that continues to Judgment Day to something where we're on the downhill is going to be the topic of our panel this morning. We have an absolutely superb panel. I am privileged to be here with these people. I want to tell you that when I am trying hard to understand the dynamics of these events and appreciate the situation, it is this set of analysts and authors that I turn to. We have Charles Lister, and he will lead off with what happens next in Syria. He's been one of the most thorough and thoughtful analysts on the situation in Syria. He will be followed by Elizabeth Kendall, who has been deeply involved in not only the broader issues of jihad and how it figures culturally in Islam, but also specifically on the ground in Yemen, which is another important component of the struggle. She will be followed by Rita Katz, who has been focusing on the jihad through the internet, the very effective use of the jihadists, and especially by ISIS, of social media to extend the struggle. Rita will be followed by Jacob Zenn, who has been devoting his attention to Africa, where both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have foothold. And then my good friend Eitan Azani will talk more broadly about, one, our ability to predict the outcome of this contest, or even the next phase, and how it may evolve in terms of its many parts, and so he will bat cleanup. I've asked each a person not to give us a presentation, but rather to just give us a handful of provocative headlines for us to think about. So we're going to go through that very quickly and then follow up with a series of questions. Charles, why don't we begin with you?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Brian, and thank you to the RBC for having me here. I'll do my very best to keep to a strict time limit and to make some provocative statements, which, looking through my notes, I think I probably will successfully do. Is this working? Okay. To start off with, I think it's going to be no surprise to anyone here to hear me say that we're no way near the end of this struggle. I would agree with one of the hypotheses that Brian put forward, which is to suggest that we're perhaps entering into a new phase or a new iteration of that struggle. In recent years, I'm going to focus my brief remarks on things that have emanated out of what's taken place in Syria, rather than necessarily trying to predict what's going to happen there next, which I think perhaps can wait for the workshop on the quote-unquote Syrian quagmire, which I think is tomorrow. But in recent years, and as I say, this has emanated primarily from Syria, I think we're entering out of a period of intense lesson learning and adaptation, which has developed within the Salafi Jihadi movement. Syria has been, in many respects, the testing ground for a lot of this lesson learning, which has been both on the ISIS and the Al-Qaeda side of this range of threats. And throughout this period, I think what we've seen is a very slow and very methodical advance up what I would call the scale of progress. In other words, I think we have seen a smarter, more intelligent, and more capable adversary develop out of this period of lesson learning and adaptation than we perhaps faced before. There have been far more examples of a lack of success than there have been success, but precisely because of that process, I would predict at least that the next iteration of threats that we will face will be yet more intelligent and potentially more durable. But basically, on a big picture, what we've seen come out of Syria, and I would also argue out of Yemen and Mali and elsewhere, is the development or the adaptation of three separate models of jihad. Two of them are well known, and one of them is the new one, which I think has primarily been tested out in Syria. The first is, of course, ISIS. Not 2.0, 3.0. ISIS remains the exact same organization, in my view, that it was and in its early roots in Iraq in 2003. It has practiced the exact same process of evolution and transition and adaptation that we're continuing to see to this day. In fact, it has been almost entirely predictable how they've operated over the last 15 years. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, has gone through a series of significant adaptations. In Syria, we've seen it, I'll talk a little bit in more detail about this in a minute, but basically an experiment with nationalism. How far can we stretch our ideology to sustain our more long-term project, to acquire more popular support? More recently, we've seen Al-Qaeda, in terms of its real loyalist forces, revert back to the traditional elite vanguard model that people like Osama bin Laden would have espoused. The new model is the one that I've taken the most interest in, and that has, I think, come out of previous failed experiments in Mali and Yemen, and perhaps more success in Syria than anywhere else. And that is, as I say, the experiment with nationalism and an attempt to create a more populist, nationally focused Salafi Jihadi movement. So it is truly an attempt to stretch the ideology as far as possible, to create a project that is far more durable and presents a challenge that, as international, quote-unquote, Western states, is far more difficult to challenge. And I think that is something that's worthy of a great deal more research, and I'll come on to that briefly in a minute. But another big picture point I wanted to make at this point was an expansion of one of the initial points I made, which is that Salafi jihadism over the last 30 years, I think, has grown in both scale and reach. And one of the consequences of that, and this is one of the provocative statements I'll make, is an international willingness to accept latent Salafi jihadi insurgencies and or terrorism in theatres of conflict or instability in which we have perceived less interest appears to have increased. In other words, our willingness to accept some extent of these activities has increased over time as it has expanded its reach into a broader geographical space. So has our acceptance of this become a new reality? This is going to be something we are going to live with. It is operating in so many countries in which we have done little or nothing to intervene. So therefore the question I think we all need to raise to ourselves is what does that mean about the threat perceptions that these different organizations present? And as an extension of that, I would give a few examples, and to be provocative again. The Global Coalition's intervention in Iraq and Syria was basically provoked by the execution of British and American hostages and a potentially imminent genocide of Yazidis. But what would have happened if ISIS had played it more intelligently and simply fallen back and consolidated? Would we have seen a massive 70-plus country intervention in Iraq and Syria, or something far more limited, or anything at all? In Syria, with the exception of about a 12-month period between 2014 and 2015, the activities of Al-Qaeda have been virtually irrelevant for Western interests. We appear to have just accepted that Al-Qaeda is operating in this area with little or no consequence. And groups like Hezbollah and various Shia militias, many of which are internationally designated terrorist organizations, have almost been accepted as legitimate actors in the Syrian case. In fact, our governments have negotiated agreements in which they have been included rather than excluded. So there's a number of provocative questions. Very, very briefly, on the Syrian nationalist experiment. As I said, the roots lie in failed experiments in Mali and in Yemen. I think that experiments have been advanced and the most successful test cases come in Syria. Why has it come about? It was clearly an attempt to differentiate from ISIS. So a dynamic of intra-jihadi competition has resulted in multiple new models which present entirely different challenges. I could go into this in a huge amount of detail, but obviously I won't. But as another consequence of this was, or another reason why we've seen this develop, is the increasing decentralization of Al-Qaeda as a global movement. It isn't, I don't think, an organization anymore. We now know from public open source intelligence that there was an almost 2-year period in which Al-Qaeda's leaders in Syria were incapable of sending messages to Al-Qaeda's global leadership in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The direct consequence of that is that Al-Qaeda's affiliates spread out across the world have increasingly been making their own decisions rooted in local dynamics, which have decentralized them further and further from the global cause. The consequence of that is the third model of jihad that I was talking about earlier. The only reason why I raise that is because if we look at an area like Syria and we talk about a challenge like Idlib, my hypothesis is a scorched earth solution for Idlib is the best scenario that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the former Nusra affiliate, has right now. They are facing an imminent territorial defeat, but their best chance is that anything that will serve to justify the narrative that they have been selling to a local population all along, which is that we are nationally focused, not globally focused, which is that you should never have trusted the international community in the first place. In the end, you will all be betrayed and the regime will come back in. This is the best chance, but the reason why I raise this is, well, what do we do to challenge these movements who have embedded themselves so deeply within local narratives? This is not the same kind of challenge that we faced from Al-Qaeda in the past, and it's certainly not the same challenge that we faced from the likes of ISIS. So for exactly that reason, I raise this as a big challenge that I think we'll face going forward.
Thank you, Charles. There's a number of questions in there. We'll come back to those very, very quickly. I'm going to move right on to Elizabeth with your experience in Yemen.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. And I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that Charles made. I have also observed in Yemen a fragmentation, a decentralization of the jihad movements. And my last trip into Yemen was actually about two weeks ago, so I've got quite a lot of fresh news from the ground. And it's very easy to think from the news that filters out more formally that we're winning this war against terrorism inside Yemen. During 2017, the United States conducted over 130 drone and a few airstrikes in Yemen against both Islamic State in Yemen, which is a very small group, and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And indeed, we have seen many of its leaders disappear. One of the things I spend most time doing is tracking the cultural material put out by these groups, and seen quite a lot of lament poems appearing as their leaders get droned, and then their successors also get droned. It's just been a constant stream of laments and martyrologies. But that said, even last year, in 2017, even after the Al-Qaeda state was dismantled, even after so many people were droned, so many Al-Qaeda leaders were droned, Al-Qaeda was still able to conduct 273 operations inside Yemen. So this is a greatly diminished group. That's huge. Now, this year, that number has reduced to, during 2018, to fewer than a third. But what has happened is that we're seeing lots and lots of individual little groups that are essentially leaderless, conducting their own little operations. And I follow many of these groups. I'm inside the groups on Telegram. And so they're not appearing as formal terrorist claims, but they're informal groups that are working with local communities. So what we're seeing is decentralization and fragmentation of the jihad. It could be an even more difficult problem, actually, to deal with long term. Second point, the labels, therefore, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, are losing their relevance on the ground. So I think they're quite convenient for us to use. We like to see, when I give presentations to military audiences, I often get asked questions like, well, so who are the top level of command? And then what's the next level of command? But it's not really working like that anymore. It's much messier. And not even the identifiers of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State themselves are being used with quite such regularity. It's more, well, we're mujahideen. That doesn't mean, though, as I had initially anticipated, that the groups might be blending more. What it means, really, is that they're cracking more into these little splinters. And in fact, what we have seen very recently, in the last 2 months and ongoing, is a big bust-up between some of these groups that we can identify, or they can identify themselves under the rubric Islamic State, just a small pocket, and Al-Qaeda in Yemen, also in a very small pocket. So on the surface, it looks like some kind of apocalyptic meeting where Al-Qaeda and Islamic State are thrashing it out. But this is nothing of the kind. It's more a sort of small tribal dispute, and some of the complaints that I've been hearing on the ground are from the group that we identify as Al-Qaeda, things like, oh, Islamic State, we don't like them, they're really lazy, they don't get up before lunchtime, and even when they do go to the battlefront against the Houthis, they're more interested in taking photos of themselves and posting them than they are actually fighting. Another one is Islamic State, they're such bullies, they always drive through Al-Qaeda checkpoints without stopping and knock over all our stuff. They pitched their camp behind us, right behind us, which is really annoying because this is our territory, and then at night they came and they ripped open our tents with their knives and cut them all, so then we had to mend them, and that was annoying. So there's lots of this is not a battle of masterminds exactly. It's much more a sort of, youth thugs in a tribal situation. And I don't think that Islamic State has really managed to penetrate into this tribal society. It's more disgruntled youths waving around black flags in front of iPhones and it's identifying themselves sometimes as Islamic State, but it's much more localized than that. I'll just finish by giving you an example, which is that in perhaps one of the most irresponsible academic experiments of all time, I did take the first Islamic State film to come out in Yemen in 2015. It was planting the flag very symbolically in Yemeni soil. And I decided to play this video, this Islamic State video, to different tribal groups in the east of Yemen, which became Al-Qaeda's territory, to see how it went down, to see maybe they're going to take off or maybe not. But as I was listening to the responses of the groups of tribesmen whom I was playing the video to, they were quite quite adamant that this was some kind of weird, foreign, alien infiltration, that they were unimpressed with the matching uniforms and matching sandals. They were very unimpressed with the coordinated combat moves. They thought the nasheed that was playing in the background was not very sophisticated, not like their poetry. And so they just thought it was a foreign movement that wasn't really going to make any inroads. They poo-pooed the way that the guys, the Islamic State fighters, have tied their headscarves, so that won't protect them against the sands in the East Yemen. They don't know what they're doing. And I think we've seen that now perpetuated. Islamic State really isn't going anywhere, and it's not hooking up with Al-Qaeda. It still exists, and it will always have takers. But it's Al-Qaeda that's the real problem, and it may now be even more of a problem given its splintering. It's like shattering a glass. It's like a dirty bomb of jihadis.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. By the way, as a heads up, just being very cognizant of words that I'm hearing nationalist experiments, populist, local dynamics, decentralization, fragmentation, splintering. I mean, there is a bit of a theme developing in terms of an overall assessment, and I want to hold on to that. But Rita, let me go ahead with you very quickly. I know you've got some slides here, but
Can you hear me? Thank you again for having me. I'm always happy to visit Israel, as you probably guessed that. So I think that we will all agree that ISIS is very centralized versus Al-Qaeda, that has, from the beginning, was a decentralized organization. And the big question that we're asked is about the future of global jihad. The future of global jihad really very much depends on us. And the cycle, breaking the cycle of global jihad, the jihad that sustain the global jihad network can be broken, and it depends on whether or not we can learn from past mistakes. The last 2 decades clearly prove that significant military success and victories did not translate to the defeat of the jihadi groups on the ground. To the contrary, these groups continue to thrive, continue to regroup, despite territorial setbacks, despite the fact that Al-Qaeda was completely removed from its bases in Afghanistan at that time. The group resurfaced, and the problem even mushroomed, became even bigger. It spread all over the world, and from having one group, jihadi group, Al-Qaeda, now we're facing 2 jihadi groups. And due to the competition between the 2 groups, the activities are more brutal and more spread. The last 2 decades provided the Al-Qaeda a new infrastructure. The counterinsurgency that the United States used, along with its allies, was focused mainly on the military battleground, victories on the ground, either directly or through its partners. But it failed to pay attention to what was really the new space that Al-Qaeda adopted, that the jihadis adopted, that enabled them to continue recruit, train, finance, plan attacks, pretty much with no disturbance, and that was the internet. I remember when I first was mentioning the problem of the internet in my meetings at the DoD, they used to say, well, if it is the internet, how difficult can it be for us to find the information? And I never felt that there was an equal or any policy set aside to let's counter both battles at the same time. What happened in the last decade was that the jihadi groups focused on the internet on password-protected message boards. These message boards were very contained. It was almost impossible for new members to join. They had numbers. There were 2 main message boards, sister organizations that really put together all the jihadists in various languages. Members were between 5,000 to 7,000 from all over the world. These message boards not only allow the communications between members, but they also allow the communications between the jihadi groups. Oftentimes we would see communications between Shabab and Akim done not physically because of obvious difficulties, but through the message boards. And I remember the day when one of the government entities in Iraq contacted me and said, we cannot understand how is it possible that we're finding the IED manual that was used here in Fallujah, the exact same manual is found now within the Shabab. I said, it's pretty easy. They're using the exact same platforms, these password-protected message boards. Now, recent decade, this whole small online jihadi community transformed into a massive network due to two main factors: war in Syria, along with the smartphones. Now, the smartphones enabled the entire world to be connected at the same time through social media. That enabled the jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to capitalize on the war in Syria, recruit, brainwash, and bringing thousands of members from all over the world, supporters, to Syria. It didn't happen in one day. It was an online process, publicly published. Now, very important message that we have to remember, and I think many of you will agree with me, about jihadism, is that it doesn't live in the dark. It needs the public. It needs to be as public as it's possible. It doesn't live in the dark web. It lives very much in wherever the audience is. And wherever there are more people, that's where you will find them. You'll find them on Instagram, you will find them on Facebook, and you will find them directly connecting to any potential recruit. So that's why even the most recent territorial setbacks in Syria, in Iraq, did not even put a dent in the ISIS media and the entire infrastructure of radicalization. ISIS media at the moment continues to fully operate with its own sophisticated media machine, yet it controls complete centralization of any content that will be published online. It created a mechanism, it created a network that only if you really understand how it works, you can understand how you defeat it. Because when there are defeats on the ground, that media network online continues to work, continue to mobilize, continue to radicalize and incite for attacks. Just to give you an example, and probably now more than ever, the use of online for the jihadists is extremely important. Between a new study that was done by SIDE, between April 1st and July 31st, Don, if you don't mind, please, can you put the first slide? Oh, thank you. Between April 1st and July 31st, SIDE collected 23,000 instances of online jihadi media that was disseminated on various platforms. More than 100 platforms were used for these 23 and more thousand links. Now, these links are only ISIS and Al-Qaeda media spread all over the internet. Now, you can see the portion of ISIS, which is about 85% of these links were ISIS affiliated versus the last percentage of, small percentage of Al-Qaeda media. Why is this happening? Why is it that ISIS is being so popular on media? What is making the group be so everywhere online? The secret of ISIS is that it's being operated by huge army of ISIS supporters online that are spread all over the world. ISIS media, when it's releasing any kind of media release, comes in a very lame format. That lame format of one link within a few minutes will be immediately packaged to influence the entire network. What I'm showing here on this slide, and was very important for me for people to understand the structure, because when you really understand how things work with no shortcuts, spending the time, you can fight the infrastructure. You can fight the infrastructure that on a daily basis continues to radicalize and incite people for attacks. The centralized, as you can see, it's a centralized hierarchy with sophisticated infrastructure, while the Al-Qaeda infrastructure is completely different. Al-Qaeda infrastructure, as you can see there, is spread and divided between the different groups. Every group has its own responsibility for the release of information, while with ISIS it's completely centralized and then it's published. ISIS also completely controls every piece of propaganda that is released by its supporting groups. At the same time, the jihadi media reflects very much the developments on the ground. Anytime that the groups can capitalize on local conflicts, local incidents, they will do that through its media. So when you follow the media, you can see the trend. We could see the problem happening in Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, where ISIS was calling for fighters to go to that area, when ISIS was calling its fighters to join Khorasan province in Afghanistan, greater Afghanistan area. Attacks in Afghanistan increased, it doubled the amount this year in general attacks, and the suicide operations in these 7 months tripled the attacks last year at the same time. The bottom line is that this war can be stopped. This cycle of jihad can be stopped. However, it requires a joint cooperation and hard work from governments, from lawmakers, along with technology companies. Only then the cycle can stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm on. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. And let me segue with these three excellent panelists by discussing the case of West and Northwest Africa. Because here in Yemen, we have ISIS and Al-Qaeda cutting open each other's tents and being mean to each other. In Syria, it's probably a little worse, imprisoning, maybe beheading each other. And in North and West Africa, actually, there's more of a concert of powers between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And let me also give Rita credit, because SITE was really the first organization to notice that Boko Haram was getting involved in the internet in 2010. And of course, now Boko Haram is fully part of the ISIS online infrastructure. So let me explain why I think ISIS and Al-Qaeda can get along in Northwest Africa and West Africa. And I think the main key is actually historic, and both of them have had terrible experiences with the takfirism, which is the concept of excommunication of other Muslims, which among jihadists usually leads jihadist groups to believe that only we are the true Muslims and everyone else in the entire world who is not part of our group is not a Muslim and therefore can be killed. So it's a very destructive ideological virus that exists within specifically jihadism. And so AQIM originated in the early 1990s in Algeria when elections were canceled, and then a group called the GIA emerged, Armed Islamic Group, and it ended up becoming Takfiri. And this was very negative for bin Laden, who was then in Sudan, and for the emerging Al-Qaeda project in Algeria. So suffice it to say, AQIM learned that Takfirism is very, very bad. Now, Boko Haram had a similar experience with Takfirism, because the group began its insurgency that continues to today in 2009. And it also had an opportunity to gain popular support, just like the Algerians did. Because when the elections were canceled in the 90s in Algeria, there was an upswell of popular support for the Mujahideen, which they lost because of Takfirism. In 2009, when the Nigerian security forces killed 800 followers of Boko Haram, which was mostly a preaching group then, a Salafi preaching group, there was actually an opportunity to gain popular support. But quickly the leader, Abu Bakr Shekau, morphed into Takfirism, and even the members of Boko Haram in 2009, some of whom were actually in the Algerian GIA, Nigerians in the GIA, wrote to AQIM saying, we have another GIA guy here in Nigeria who's excommunicated the entire world, including ourselves. And that's why you see in Nigeria some of these major atrocities against all different types of Muslim boy students, kidnapping schoolgirls, and all that. So they're all against Takfirism, and I think that's something that that the Nigerians and the Algerians have learned. Now, when Baghdadi declared the caliphate, AQIM's strategy, there's two options. One option put on the table was, we know ISIS are Takfiris, so let us join with them so we can tame the Takfiris and keep our movement unified. The other idea in AQIM was, we know that Takfiris will end up dying out because it's unsustainable, so let's just theologically attack them. And that's what AQIM chose to do, and it seems to have been pretty wise, because now ISIS is sort of on the downhill, and AQIM has been able to sustain itself and show that this Takfiri thing was not what we want to join. In the case of Boko Haram, they actually joined ISIS, and that might seem like a paradox, but here's where ISIS might get a little nuanced, because ISIS itself has at least two factions. And the members of ISIS who are communicating with Boko Haram, the ones in Iraq who are communicating with Boko Haram, actually don't have a very Takfiri ideology. For example, they don't consider people, they told Boko Haram, if people don't join your group and they decide to live outside of the caliphate, you don't need to kill them. So although Boko Haram is part of ISIS today, the leaders of Boko Haram in the ISIS-affiliated faction are actually former Al-Qaeda allied members of Boko Haram who oppose Takfirism. And so I think there's a general ideological understanding in North and West Africa that this whole Takfiri thing is negative. And I think the broader trend that this might reflect for the jihadist community is whether other jihadist groups in different regions of the world can learn from the ISIS experience that this excessive Takfirism, that the excessive killing of civilians, that the excessive brutality of the killing of the journalists can actually be counterproductive or something to reject. And once jihadi groups can come to that understanding, it seems like they can work together in concert. And that's why you don't see actually anti-Al-Qaeda polemics coming from the Boko Haram ISIS group. You actually, in their most recent statements, they actually praised the way Al-Qaeda helped them. And the only place where you see splintering in North and West Africa is as you move away from the leadership of the AQIM in Algeria towards Burkina Faso and Niger, and even now towards Ivory Coast and Ghana, you start seeing the farthest range of foot soldiers who seem to have divided loyalties between ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that looks a little bit like this Yemen scenario where they just throw the label on each other, but they can still get along and fight, often for local causes, but for the broader labels. But in sum, it seems like in North and West Africa, there's an agreement on what the jihadi ideology doesn't accept, and as a result of that, they can get along without killing each other. The ultimate effect of them not killing each other and possibly getting along could be the exchange of tactics. Although right now we only see ISIS exchanging tactics with ISIS and AQ exchanging tactics with AQ, like up-armored vehicles that to do suicide bombings are only going between ISIS Boko Haram and ISIS Libya or ISIS Syria, not to AQ. And certain AQ style of bombs are not going to ISIS. So it's not like they're sharing information, but one of the effects of them possibly getting along could be developing better tactics here and there.
Thank you very much. Another set of words here. I mean, morphing, fluid, some getting along, some others not getting along, some cooperation at upper levels, some fighting at the lower levels, constantly changing. That's actually a perfect segue into Eitan, who, if I'm guessing right, does not see this as a unified enterprise, but a very complex, fluid enterprise. Eitan?
Thank you very much, Brian. And thank you very much, ICT, for inviting me to this conference. And I want to start my discussion in a different way. As you know, the subject of this panel is the future of global jihad. My argument is that we don't have any tool to describe or to predict the future of global jihad, because we have too many actors that are operating on these things. They are not monolithic. They are operating all over the world, and we have a lot of mega events that influence the direction of big organizations. Let's start just from the last 10 years. Started with the Arab Spring, continue with the Caliphate, establishment of the Caliphate, the collapse of the Caliphate, civil wars in different parts around the world. And these organizations continue to survive within all these major events within this field. So if I try to base three different areas that can influence the future of global jihad, one of the things I totally agree with what my colleague here, Rita, said. What the Western societies will do against this global jihad? Should they operate together? How to operate together? Intelligence that they need together for these operations. Understanding exactly what is the meaning of these organizations that are operating on the ground. Understanding the culture, because people talk here, discuss here the tribal culture. This is a daily culture of these organizations. People describe the culture of how directive runs from the level of the leadership to the level of the local commanders on the ground. We need to bear in our mind that these global jihadists, some of their major strategy is the global Islamic resistance called by Abu Mahab al-Suri that said everyone could carry out an attack inspired by the organization and don't need to be like a centralized organization like Al-Qaeda was in the beginning. So on one place, what we will do, what we, the Westerners, do to act against the global jihadists. On the other hand, what the organization, okay, how the leadership will take them from one place to the other place, how they will be more creative to carry out their operation. Everyone within this world has its own way of operation, and we need to understand how they are doing, meaning you need a lot of intelligence on these organizations and understanding how these operate on the ground. The second level is there is a process that some of you discuss it here, that the organization a transition. There is a transition within the organization from centralization into decentralization. But it's a major difference between these two organizations because Al-Qaeda started this process in 2001. So the structures of Al-Qaeda is more solid. Their ability to run an organizational directive, their ability to deliver a modus operandi, their ability to translate policy into strategy is more robust than the capabilities of ISIS that are started only at the beginning, is now only at the beginning of the decentralization process. We need also to bear in our mind that we are talking about global jihadists. Global jihadists don't talk about nationalism. Global jihadists, the mindset is Ummah. The Ummah, this is meaning the global arena. This is the reason why the internet enabled them to deal with this component all the time. And the last level that I want to put on the ground, this is the difference between the leaders. On one hand, we have the leader of Al-Qaeda that he is very cautious, he's doing things step after step. On the other hand, we have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi that he wants to run things very fast and he thinks that he can conquer the world. Different leaders that influence the operations of their leaders on the ground. So we can't predict and say these organizations develop to this side, these organizations develop to that side, because there are, as I mentioned before, a lot of factors that influence the directions of these organizations.
If I were to say, if I had given a briefing right after 9/11, massive centrally directed attack with huge consequences in the West, and said that 17 years down the road here, we're still going to be at this. This has become normalized. But the good news is we are going to be looking at something that is far more local, that operates at a lower level, has a broader reach, but it's low yield. Or we have al-Baghdadi now in his latest message saying he wants people to attack the United States, drive cars over people, stab people, things of this sort. Is that an improvement or a greater threat? Elizabeth? Would that be good news or bad news?
That's so difficult. I think it's exactly what I was talking about. It's because we're now less centralized, and we've got all these little groups. It's almost worse news because it's much more difficult to track. But that said, although the ambition is still there to launch an incredibly headline-grabbing attack against the West in both Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, it's very hard to see how, certainly the groups I work with in Al-Qaeda, how they could possibly manage it. They can't even get out of Yemen at the moment. But what is interesting is that just 2.5 weeks ago, we had quite a lengthy publication that was talking about we're going to do something that's even bigger than 9/11, and we can justify killing 4 million Americans, including 1 million children, because that's how many they've killed in the Ummah over the last few years. And so we're going to do it, and we can justify a dirty bomb, essentially. This came out just 2.5 weeks ago from a group in within Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Right, but how are they going to do it? I mean, the ambition is still there. It's still very dangerous, but I think we've got more of a handle on it.
Would you say that we haven't dented their determination, but we have certainly degraded their operational capability?
Yeah, that's right. And I think what will happen is that whenever this problem will never go away, in the sense I agree with my colleagues here, because local issues and local grievances will always be sellotaped to, will be harnessed on to a global jihadist agenda. It's not that difficult to take a local issue and just sandwich it together with global jihad. One of the most crazy things I saw was the Al-Qaeda state in Mukalla in November 2015, when I was nearby in the region, holding this big festival which was called Jerusalem We're Coming. And, you know, I've been working with these tribes for some time. I mean, they didn't stop to think about Jerusalem in their normal lives. And yet suddenly, all their local grievances, all the things, oh, we haven't got great roads, our hospitals aren't stocked, our doctors are not being paid, our schools are poorly run, suddenly get blamed on, you know, harnessed to an agenda of global jihad, and Jerusalem gets wheeled into it. It's just too easy.
Rita, I'm going to ask you a different question.
Can I have
Online.
that same question also?
Okay, but
more.
online jihad, the difficulty with online jihad, it is really difficult to remotely inspire people to do things.
Okay.
It's low yield or.
Okay.
Virtual armies remain virtual. So they have greater reach, greater communications, and can get an attack here and there, but can they ascend to the volume that would be required to really threaten national security?
First of all, I'll start with Baghdad. I think that the paradox is that there was no country that didn't broadcast that speech. That speech came online, only. And everybody, it was the topic of discussion everywhere. Basically, Baghdadi is delivering a message to all his followers online simultaneously. Everywhere in the world can hear it. It is so ironic that we are basically providing the platform on which he calls carry out attack all over the world. And what is done afterward is that we're sitting and discussing how dangerous it's going to be. I can tell you what happened minutes after that speech. First of all, it came amidst where dozens of reports said he's dead. They buried him, he is somewhere, somebody else, they named several successors for him already, and then the speech came during Eid al-Adha. When the speech came minutes after, the global jihadi community was flooding the internet with pledges. I posted on my Twitter account several of these pledges. They all renewed the pledges to Baghdadi. In addition to that, they packaged all his statements in every language you can just imagine, Indonesian, English, Bengali, etc., with the statements of whatever was relevant to that specific country. And that's what happens all the time. These broadcasts, these media done by ISIS or Al-Qaeda is basically being published by us and reaching out to everyone in the world that isn't not really specifically in communication with the world. Yesterday, breaking news was that UK government found direct communication between people in Khorasan, ISIS people in Khorasan, and operatives in London that were trying to plot an attack. Obviously, is this new? The internet, the telegram, the applications that are taking place today, when I heard yesterday, for instance, in Israel, ICP companies block certain Twitter accounts, but they're all on applications. WhatsApp, does anyone doesn't use WhatsApp? Does anyone doesn't use Telegram? We heard Elizabeth that she's monitoring AQAP on Telegram. Now, how dangerous can it be for our national security? Currently, attacks do not need to be plotted in one physical location. You don't need to sit with the leaders and plot attacks. Most of the attacks that were carried out after 9/11 in the West, in the United States, were either inspired or attacks that manuals were actually disseminated online, or attacks that were coordinated online along with operational leaders from all over the world, whether it is with AQAP or with the Shabab, etc. Just last week, Shabab video showed several Canadian and foreign fighters that were killed in the Shabab, which means that these groups can continue to radicalize and recruit people into their ground space. And just before I finish, I know that Brian wants me to end what I want to say, but I think this is a fascinating example just to illustrate how important the fight on the ground. Elizabeth earlier mentioned that ISIS is very small in Yemen. I totally agree with her. But AQAP, when the conflict, what she was referring to is that ISIS has been in existence in Yemen for about 4 years, since ISIS declared the caliphate and even before that. But there were no struggles between AQAP and ISIS. This was one of the only places in the world that we didn't hear about any conflicts between the two of them. And it was a fascinating example to follow. Suddenly, a month ago, ISIS released a video that it arrested AQAP prisoners because AQAP broke the agreement that they had between them, which means that they had a joint agreement that we are not going to attack each other, because right now Yemen has no government and our joint enemy is the Houthis. So the fight was focused on Houthis, don't involve anyone. Now, Elizabeth mentioned very correctly that AQAP is the large organization there, that ISIS is nothing. Yet, in the last month, AQAP put 4 releases, 2 of them by videos, against ISIS, which means that even though the problem of ISIS is so minor, it really realized that they have to fight for the hearts of minds of the global jihadi community. The chance that the locals are going to be watching these statements and these videos are very minimal. But the online jihadi community will definitely watch these. On the other hand, ISIS responded to these accusations and these videos. ISIS executed its people from AQAP. AQAP threatened to do the same. But this was all broadcast live online, and that's where the groups actually learn from each other. But the bottom line is that you cannot survive today if you don't have a solid media infrastructure fighting for the hearts and minds of this global community, whether it is by the name of jihad or Islam, it doesn't matter. It's a goal that they are trying to achieve. As Zarqawi said it in one of his most popular magazines that he had, he said one sentence that I will never forget. It was back in 2004. He said, this whole war is a media war. And the media is up to you what you decide to do with it. If you lose a very significant battle, but you capitalize on it and you propagate for it and you make yourself look as the winner, you are the winner. So you can change the reality based on how you write and what you do with the media that you have. And Zarqawi was the first person, the first group that utilized the internet 100%, totally. And only when he joined Al-Qaeda, the situation completely became more vulnerable.
Charles, if I'm
Sorry.
Charles, if I'm trying to mobilize Western governments to act in unity and to make military investments and other investments to combat this, and I tell them that these are very local contests, extremely complicated at the local level, they can try to inspire something abroad, but mainly this is going to be a component of a local civil war, of a local conflict. How do I persuade governments to make the investment to go up against that when it's not representing the major threat, the visible threat to the West?
Thank you. It's a brilliant question. I suspected it might have come up. It does often when I make these points. You know, in my view, there's a number of ways of answering the question. The first and the most obvious one is, my personal opinion is, counterterrorism community has become overly focused on just protecting the homelands. You hear it all the time in the United States. We've done an amazing job, which we have, of protecting the homeland since 9/11 from a major centralized coordinated attack. And yet we've still found ourselves involved in multiple conflicts around the world because of more localized terroristic insurgencies, which provide safe haven for smaller cells of covert operatives who are interested in global operations. The brief 12-month period I talked about in Syria, in which something we labeled the Khorasan group emerged, was the example of how a very effective Al-Qaeda-linked safe haven provided the space for an extremely effective, well-developed veteran network of global operatives could begin plotting external attacks. That's my fear, is that if we take our eye off the ball because we think the threat to the homeland isn't imminent, we're suddenly going to be faced with multiple expansive safe havens from which we have little to no intelligence because we haven't been focusing on it, and from which global operatives can emanate. You know, we need only look at Afghanistan pre-2001 and the kind of safe haven that represented and what came out of there to learn that very same lesson. In 2000, I find it very hard to imagine many people were advocating in the White House and elsewhere that we need to be keeping a really urgent eye on what's happening there. But look what came out of it. It transformed the world. And so I think this is an incredibly important point to make, and it is an important question to answer. And that's precisely why I keep trying to emphasize that this evolution of movements into this more nationally focused sphere doesn't mean that we no longer face a threat. It means we face an entirely different level of a challenge. And the one other point I just want to make on this, which is equally important, is that if a model like this eventually... If a movement like this eventually succeeds, and the safe haven exists for long enough, and the group itself is deemed to be having such an effect in terms of providing services to the local population, a semblance of stability, which the Nusra Front in Syria for a long time was perceived to be doing across many countries in the Middle East. I used to travel all around the region at 2013, 14, 15, 16, and no matter what country I was in, it was hard to find anyone who thought that the Nusra Front was a bad thing at that time, because they were perceived to be doing something that was legitimate. So my fear is, eventually, does that result in official overt state support for an organization that has effectively persuaded people that they are no longer Al-Qaeda, they are no longer globalists, and they are something a little different? And we started to see inklings of that in 2015 and 2016 in Syria, was largely cut off. Now we have a movement which has links to Al-Qaeda at least, although I don't think they're following any of Al-Qaeda's instructions, but is overtly seeking contact with foreign governments. And you know, the last information I've heard from inside the organization is that they have been overtly seeking contact with the United States, with European countries. There are European countries who have contacted me and said, is it time we start to talk to this organization, explore what they're really about? What do they really want? What are their red lines? That's the success that I'm warning about. The legitimization of that model results in all kinds of different challenges. And most importantly, to your question, the safe haven from which the threats we fear the most will emanate.
Last question, very, very quickly, to you, Jacob. The fact that we have to go after these sanctuaries, these zones where they can operate that may become the future launching pads for attack, does that then condemn us to a kind of perpetual imperial warfare as in ancient Rome, where we have legions constantly battling somewhere in the world in order to protect the homeland?
Thanks, Brian. Also, another challenging question. But I would say this, from an African perspective, of someone who follows it in Africa, is where the role of Africa comes in, because before 2001, no one even knew about the Taliban, and then all of a sudden Afghanistan became the heart of the conflict. And then before the Syrian conflict, nobody was really thinking of Syria, and then it happened. And now there's obviously a lot of attention in Afghanistan, South Asia, a lot of attention in Syria. And if we're trying to stop that big attack, and we think that big attacks require havens where people can plan, is sort of where you might begin to look at Africa, because there's not a lot of international attention there. There's a lot of jihadists, and we're a little bit tired. We don't want to become that imperium. We don't want to go into Nigeria. We don't want to go into Niger or Chad. We're going to have as many problems there as we have elsewhere in terms of culture and language. But you have the ideology there. You have the groups. And the thing is, the groups there are more focused on consolidating their local control now, and they actually don't want the imperium to come, because then they can't control, you know, the territory for themselves. So they're careful not to do that. So I mean, that might be some type of accommodation where they don't want us there, and so long as we don't come there, they're not going to try to attack us. And at the same time, we don't want to go there. And in fact, in the case of Boko Haram, they're careful not to, you know, even attack our embassies there, because they just want their local caliphate. But I mean, that's a risk for us, and it's a risk for them. But I think the key thing is, in my view, West Africa is one of the last places where you have a lot of jihadis who have the capability to attack us if they so wanted. But right now they don't, and we don't have the interest or capabilities to run around there and chase them if they so did. So that's why we work with local governments who maybe or maybe not have the capacity to do that.
Future of global jihad, decentralizing, fragmenting, continuing, morphing, adapting, in some cases a greater threat because of its spread, in other cases less of a threat because of its inability to mount large-scale operations. And against this a threat, we have a group of Western nations, including the United States, tired of pursuing it, but under continuing pressure to do so. That would be a breathtaking generalization summary of our comments here, but that seems to be the future, or futures, plural, of the global jihad. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention, please. I want to thank Brian Jenkins for being on time and efficient, as usual. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could continue the discussions outside, please, because we now have a keynote address by Ambassador Edmund Fitton Brown. So, if you don't mind, is it possible to maybe continue your interaction outside? Thank you. Great. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Ambassador Edmund Fitton Brown. He's the coordinator of ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban monitoring team of the United Nations. Ambassador Edmund Fitton Brown has served as the UN monitoring team coordinator since January 2018. He is a former UK diplomatic service officer, finishing as UK ambassador to Yemen in 2017. Ambassador Fitton Brown has extensive international experience with Middle East counterterrorism and security focus. Previously, he was posted in Finland, Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Italy, United Arab Emirates. Ambassador Fitton Brown is an Arabic, Italian, and a Finnish speaker. Maybe you'll share with us which country was the most pleasant to be in of all of those countries we just mentioned. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. Sorry, can you hear me? Yes. For that introduction, and thank you to all of you, and thank you for this invitation. That was a fulsome introduction, so I won't introduce myself other than to confirm that I'm the coordinator of the United Nations 1267 and 1988 Committees Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team. We are mandated to liaise with member states' counter-terrorism agencies, intelligence and security services, in support of sanctions on ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban. I'm always keen to promote the CT options that our regime offers to member states to freeze the assets of ISIL and Al-Qaeda terrorists and stop them from traveling and procuring weapons. The monitoring team is also the UN entity responsible for assessing the global threat from ISIL and Al-Qaeda. In addition, we use our convening power to promote international cooperation between CT agencies, working very closely with the other UN organizations concerned with counterterrorism. And we write recommendations which sometimes inform new UN Security Council resolutions on counterterrorism. Resolution 2368 of last year sets out our current mandate for those interested in looking at the detail of it, and I could, of course, provide more detail of that if anyone's interested in the margins of this conference. But turning to the main topic of this talk, I want to zero in on the threat assessment as we see it. ISIL has been militarily defeated in Iraq and almost so in Syria. We've been speaking for some time of its reversion from a pseudo-state with state-like structures, assets and liabilities, into a covert global network, albeit one still concentrated in Iraq, Syria, and the immediate neighborhood. But we've also spoken of Al-Qaeda's resilience and of radicalized individuals, networks, and communities receptive to Al-Qaeda's and ISIL's broad messages. It is possible that ISIL's fast burn popularity has been harmed by military defeat, and inspired extremism and violence will adopt, at some point in the future, a third as yet unknown banner or brand. And there were some very interesting reflections on that in the last session. I want to focus on the subject of foreign terrorist fighters, or FTFs, on which much CT attention has centered. I wonder whether the easy shorthand of FTF, returnee or relocator, now perhaps conceals more than it reveals, confuses more than it explains. Let's break down the definition a little bit. From the UN or international cooperation point of view, and from the point of view of the most recent UN Security Council resolution on this subject, 2396, we must not lose sight of the core of the problem, the so-called caliphate, the leaders, ideologues, civil servants, and primarily the fighters of the pseudo-state which straddled the Iraqi-Syrian border. FTFs primarily, as a term, refers to outsiders who traveled to join this project, this struggle, this specific fight. Of course, not all FTFs have traveled to Iraq or Syria. Any conflict may attract them. Afghanistan has always been afflicted with these kind of travelers. And FTFs from countries neighboring conflict zones may present different challenges from global FTFs. I've, for example, considered the contrast between a Jordanian in Syria as against an Indonesian in Syria, TTP Pakistani in Afghanistan as against an IMU Uzbek in Afghanistan, a Tunisian national as against an Italian national in Libya, a Kenyan national as against a UK national with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, a mainland Egyptian as against a Palestinian, as against a Chechen, with Ansar Beit al-Maqdis in Sinai, or a Malaysian as against a Saudi ISIL supporter in Mindanao in the southern Philippines. They pose different challenges. There is a difference between someone who travels from a neighboring country and one who comes halfway across the globe, and they may be, one may be more dangerous than the other in some respects, or the other way around in other respects. Differences may include motivation, fighting for ideology, fighting for adventure, fighting for money, prospects for survival in the conflict zones. It may be easier for someone who's traveled more locally to blend in to the environment and survive by lying low. The future threat posed, which may be related, for example, to nationality, whether the person has certain visa requirements, what their travel mobility is. It may also affect how prone they may be to disillusionment with the terrorist organization. Returning to the Iraqi-Syrian core of the problem, various numbers are cited, but let's say there were about 40,000 FTFs of this kind. The international community is rightly concerned. Even aiming off for deaths and desertions, this is a global CT problem on an unprecedented scale. The obvious comparison is with Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan in 2001 to 2002. The numbers were much lower, but the impact of survivors, returnees, and relocators was significant. And now we face that phenomenon multiplied. Many thousands of these FTFs are still alive. Many are still fighting, many are lying low, many others are detained, mainly in Iraq. Collectively, they pose a slow burn, long-term challenge to manage, process, surveil, reintegrate. And then what about the detainees who don't fit the profile of the adult male fighter? Amongst women, how to distinguish between dependents and dangerous fanatics. Amongst minors, between young victims and teenage terrorists. And of course, you're all familiar with the excellent study by Gina Vale and Joanna Cook, tracing women and minors in ISIL, which is well worth reading if you haven't already. Huge numbers are being processed in Iraq, lesser numbers in many other countries. And this process entails great complexity, delicacy of handling, a risk of radicalization in the process, and a long-term, slow-release threat. So what are the key CT challenges in this multifaceted and evolving situation? Certainly to monitor ISIL nodes where returnees and relocators come together with indigenous networks, maybe in some cases Al-Qaeda networks. Some of the regions of concern, of course, were just covered by the last panel, to include Afghanistan and Central Asia, Southeast Asia, but certainly Libya and neighboring states, Yemen, concerns about West Africa, what might happen in Nigeria in the future, and of course we shouldn't forget many European states which have a severe problem of both homegrown radicalized individuals and the risk of returnees. And yet some United Nations member states have observed that the flow of returnees and relocators has been slower than they were expecting. And some have now become more concerned really about domestic radicalization and homegrown plots. But of course, it's important not to underestimate the capacity of FTFs to galvanize existing sympathizers, cells and networks by introducing skills and leadership qualities and organization. In places like Afghanistan, where the Khorasan province ISIL affiliate has achieved critical mass, we may see structures emerge, including external operational planning. The necessary mutation of ISIL following military defeat will make its next moves harder to predict. Despite all of the concerns about the other regions and the interesting points being made about this, the possible mutation of jihadi terrorism mixing with local nationalisms, I still think that the big news is the old news and that the new caliphate is the old caliphate, that the main danger from ISIL is in its resilience in Iraq, Syria, and the immediate neighborhood. Apart from the remaining FTFs, there are much greater numbers of Syrians and Iraqis who are affiliated or sympathetic with ISIL. The political, reconstruction, and justice and accountability issues in Iraq and Syria will keep this situation acute. The international community needs to increase its collective knowledge of ISIL finances. They enjoyed quasi-state earnings in billions of dollars and still have tens or maybe hundreds of millions in reserves. Where is it? What can we deduce about ISIL's strategic intent from their financial approach? They still have procedures for authorization of the funding that they continue, even now, to disperse. Regarding ISIL resources and investments, we should keep in mind, and the UN mandates us to keep in mind, their past and current access to looted antiquities and cultural artifacts. So far, we've found little evidence that they have fully exploited this financially, but with vigilance and study, it's possible that this will emerge, such evidence will emerge over time. Other ISIL assets and investments may be of greater significance. Controlling companies means controlling employment and patronage. Owning real estate and properties means safe houses for ISIL operatives and places to store supplies and weapons, resources. These investments, again, need much more study, but they're probably mainly in and around the core area, in and around Iraq and Syria. However troubling member states find domestic-inspired attacks, directed attacks, drawing on systematic planning and resourcing, would represent a more serious global threat, including to sectors like aviation. It's one of the reasons I think why we as part of the CT industry mustn't be unwilling occasionally to say that there's good news, and I think it's true that the military defeat of ISIL, if it's completed, will be good news and probably has already reduced the amount of directed terrorism. But this is probably a temporary phenomenon. So the completion of the military defeat must happen, and ISIL access to any equivalent haven or platform would represent an increase in the long-term threat that we all face. And that's why it would also obviously be folly to ease counter-terrorism pressure on ISIL in the Levant and the Middle East. It would also, as I think has been made amply clear from previous presentations, be a mistake to treat al-Qaeda as yesterday's problem. Their resilience and strategic patience have been remarkable. They and their allies are stronger than ISIL in many locations, not just Yemen, and they have enduring brand appeal. What happens if their leadership grows in ambition and dynamism? Ayman al-Zawahiri has successfully projected influence into the turbulent spectrum of more or less al-Qaeda-aligned groups in Idlib and western Syria, assisted by senior lieutenants such as Saif al-Adil and Abu Muhammad al-Masri. Hamza bin Laden is emerging as a charismatic leadership figure in al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula remains important to al-Qaeda's media and propaganda work. And of course, we shouldn't forget the Taliban remains a powerful ally of al-Qaeda and other aligned terrorist groups in Afghanistan. We may see ISIL FTFs joining al-Qaeda affiliates in some places, or the formation of coalitions like Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or JANIM, already referred to earlier, in the Sahel and Mali. The security vacuum and lawlessness in the middle of Africa, enabling movement and operations between Sudan, the Sahel, Nigeria, Libya, is very troubling. All of this could spell the re-emergence of al-Qaeda as a major threat, or the emergence of some new mutation, again, possibly of the type that the panel were discussing just now. It will, of course, be important, again, going back to the site presentation, it will be important to analyze Takfiri media output, including ISIL and al-Qaeda propaganda, for signposts. By way of conclusion, we should scroll back 5 years to the emergence of the caliphate and remember what were the factors which gave rise to the ISIL threat, the threat which we have got used to dominating the CT agenda in recent years. The underlying drivers which gave rise to ISIL are all still present. Significant areas of weak governance or even entirely ungoverned space, conflict which can be exploited for sectarian and extremist purposes, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, just for examples. Marginalization of communities, or sometimes of generations within communities. This curious phenomenon of young men and women born and brought up in parts of Europe, feeling motivated to become FTFs, seeking sometimes respect, maybe it's the gangster appeal, I think that was mentioned, escape from petty criminality and shame, these can all be part of it. Takfiri terrorism, jihadi terrorism in some form or other will be a threat for the foreseeable future. There is a constituency. The internet supplies options for community, radicalization, propaganda, inspiration, organization, instruction, communication, and finance. The propaganda is smart enough to play on those drivers which I just mentioned. Security and intelligence, international cooperation, policing and enforcement are still catching up with the challenge. FTFs writ large, veterans of Afghanistan, Somalia, above all Iraq and Syria, may galvanize this constituency and these networks, bringing leadership qualities, military and technical capabilities. I'll leave it there, with apologies for the rather pessimistic analysis, although I suppose on the bright side it means that we here at this conference are unlikely to be out of work anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for enlightening us and for reconfirming that in this business, we don't predict too much concealed unemployment in the not too distant future. And obviously, all of your travels throughout the Middle East have given you a very interesting perspective, which we don't always get here in Israel. So the only thing between lunch and you is me. So, therefore, please break for lunch for an hour. We'll come back here in exactly 1 hour and we'll continue the various keynote addresses. You earned your lunch. Bon appetit.